Pilgrimage to Spanish America by Everett Gill, Jr., Chapter 5. Down Chilean Valleys. If placed horizontally across the United States, Chile would reach from New York to San Francisco. Its area is greater than that of our 8 South Atlantic states, a slender strip between the mighty Andes and the Pacific Ocean. Its long, tapering shape has given it the name of the Shoestring Republic. But Texans, seeing the single white star of its national emblem, might prefer to call it the Lone Star Republic of South America. From north to south, Chile is divided into 4 sections: an arid desert in the north, a beautiful and fertile valley, a Swiss-like forest and lake country, and in the south, a cold, sparsely settled region, reaching down to Cape Horn, 1,500 miles farther south than Africa's Cape of Good Hope. From the north came the intelligent Incas of Peru, building their wide highways across the mountain and desert, and extending their dominions as far as central Chile. There, they were stopped by the fierce Araucanians, whose descendants still inhabit the southern regions of Chile. In 1535, Diego de Almagro, a brave Spanish captain, invaded Chile with a few hundred soldiers and thousands of Indian allies, but finding hostile aborigines and no gold, he departed, bitterly disappointed. 6 years later, another conqueror, Pedro de Valdivia, reached the Central Valley and founded the little settlement of Santiago, which he named in honor of St. James, patron saint of Spain. Like Coronado in Central America, he was intensely interested in colonialization and brought with him seeds and agricultural implements. For years, Valdivia and his garrison struggled with the Indians and were finally wiped out by Lautaro, one of Valdivia's escaped stable boys, who had organized and trained an Indian army for that purpose. Yet, in the face of such bitter opposition, the new colony lived. Never completely conquered, the Araucanians finally, in 1640, signed with Spain a treaty of peace, which permitted them to possess the land south of the Biobío River. To this day, many other proud descendants are more Araucanian than Chilean, since few Negro slaves were imported. Chile's 6 million people today are mostly either of Spanish, European, or Indian, or a mixture of those races. Many of them are descendants of the Basques and Catalans, among the best of the Spanish stock. Why? Did the person, is it a race? Is the person who wrote this racist, or what's going on? Freedom from Spanish rule came in 1810 under the generalship of Bernardo O'Higgins, and regardless if the group is better behaved or something overall, some one part of Spain, well, then, it's the individual you need to look at, right? Son of an Irish engineer and a Chilean mother, who, with the aid of General San Martin, drove out the Spanish overlords, although his efforts to institute vital reforms were opposed by the age-old coalition of rich landowners and powerful Roman Catholic hierarchy. His character has left an indelible stamp on Chilean life and history. Anto Antofagasta Desert Port. On a desert airfield outside of Antofagasta in northern Chile, the plane comes to a smooth landing, and then the traveler is driven toward the city over a bleak, rocky road along a coast lined with strange rock formations that once formed the bed of the ocean. Antofagasta, with over 60,000 people, is an important port and the terminus of a railroad that links it with Bolivia and Argentina. On the other side of the Andes, the influence of the British engineers who came to build railroads and to open copper mines is still much in evidence. In Arica, a town toward the north of Antofagasta, a quiet little park near the water's edge is dedicated to one of these pioneers, Sir John Jacques, who constructed the Arica-La Paz Railroad, that railway from 1909 to 1913. To one flying above the tiny ribbons of steel through Chile's wild burning wastes, they are reminders of the heroism and determination of the men who, in the face of almost insuperable difficulties, linked obscure hamlets and isolated cities with the outside world. Spiritual builders have likewise left home and loved ones and crossed the mountain heights of superstition to build a highway for God. Well, regardless of what your work is, if it's lawful from a spiritual standpoint, then, you can do it for God. Dr. and Mrs. J. L. Hart, who had been pioneer missionaries to Argentina, came to Antofagasta in 1936 and laid the foundations of a Baptist mission. They remained to see a new church building constructed, and the self-supporting congregation led by Reverend Oscar Dockmack. Their daughter, Miss Lois Hart, is a trained nurse and now directs a fine medical clinic, a Goodwill Center, and a primary school with over 100 pupils in Antofagasta. Reverend and Mrs. Howard Bryant have also centered their work in Antofagasta. For many years, they have been our only field missionaries in the 5 large provinces that stretch for 1,000 miles from Peru to Santiago. Mission points are maintained at Tarapacá and in the mining communities of Pedro de Valdivia, Chuquicamata, and Copiapo. Some of those things might be pronounced differently. It depends on which language we're using and, I guess, which route sometimes. To visit the mission in Chuquicamata, one leaves the coast and follows a road that climbs through the lower mountain ranges to a high upland plain known as the Atacama Desert. Nitrates, once the basis of Chile's economy, lie on the surface and extend to a depth of 5 to 20 feet. Giant steam shovels load the snow-white chemical into railroad cars, which transport it to enormous plants. The hot afternoon drive continues through this vast, death-like desert, while cool Indian heights rise tantalizingly in the distance. As the sun beats down, the skin dries and the lips crack. The green banks of one lonely river, the enchanting Loa, are the single sign of life and vegetation on the entire journey. One is awed at the daring of the Spanish invaders and later the liberators who crossed these arid wastes on foot or horseback, only to conclude their days and weeks of terrible marching with some fierce engagement. From the flat upland plain, the road winds through another mountain range to higher altitudes where one catches a glimpse of the snow-crowned mountains. Peter and Paul, the long tiresome ride ends toward evening in Chuquicamata at an elevation of 10,000 feet, where the rarefied atmosphere produces the unusual shortness of breath. Guests are graciously welcomed by the Chilean Exploration Company, once known as Anaconda Copper. Services are held here regularly by our missionaries, both for the English-speaking community and the Spanish-speaking workers, who meet in a modest chapel. Impressed by the practical value of this unselfish work, the different nitrate and copper mine owners have provided rent-free halls. Santiago, city of St. James. Santiago, capital of Chile, is located 700 miles south of Antofagasta, at the head of the River Valley of Chile. The valley's green fields afford a refreshing sight to the traveler after the long desert experience. A city of 1 million inhabitants, Santiago has broad avenues, lovely plazas, and modernistic apartments. There is very little to remind one of its colonial heritage, and its Roman Catholic churches are poor when compared with the splendor of those of Mexico or Peru, a situation not difficult to comprehend since Chile produced very little silver or gold, and Indian serf labor was scarce. The earliest evangelical missionary to Chile was James Thompson, who arrived in 1820 representing the British and foreign Bible study. Catholic opposition forced him to leave. 20 years later, he was succeeded by David Trumbull, a Congregationalist who was later adopted by the Presbyterians as their first missionary in this country. Southern Baptists were not represented until 1918, when Reverend and Mrs. W. E. Davidson arrived in Santiago without adequate support or reinforcements, but with encouraging results. Our Baptist missionaries have labored in this great city since that time. To meet the need for a downtown church in the heart of Santiago, a centrally located property was purchased and construction was begun in 1950. The new structure, modern in design, will serve not only for the First Baptist Church, but also as a Baptist headquarters building. Here, under the direction of Reverend John A. Parker, a varied program will be carried out, with evangelism as its core. The building will house a youth center for university students, a medical clinic for general charity work, and will also provide quarters for publication work and for a Baptist bookstore. Other missionaries associated with this institution will be Dr. R.C. Moore, in charge of publications, Miss Ann Lasseter, now in charge of primary school in the Old First Baptist Church at the edge of the city, and Miss Carrie Spears in the office of the Chilean mission headquarters. This will be the first institution of its kind among our Latin American missionaries, as a means of challenging and serving a city the size of Santiago. It has limitless possibilities. Santiago is also the home of the Chilean Baptist Theological Institute for young men and women preparing for the ministry and other full-time Christian service. In 1922, a small Bible institute was founded in conjunction with the Baptist Academy of Temuco and trained a number of capable leaders upon the recommendation of Reverend J.W. McGavock and his associates. The Foreign Mission Board in 1940 authorized the transfer of this institution to Santiago. President Honorio Espinosa has a capable faculty of nationals and missionaries, including Miss Oleta Snell, who is in charge of the women's department. Reverend H.C. McConnell, who has taught in the school since 1939, describes the varied activities of this theological school. The students have carried on practical activities in the churches and missions of Santiago and throughout the Republic during the summers. Correspondence courses, regional and local institutes have also contributed their part, and pastors have benefited through annual institutes conducted by the faculty. Baptists in general have also enjoyed a certain prestige due to the presence of their theological seminary. Words left out. We are grateful to the Foreign Mission Board and the Southern Baptists for making it possible to have this miniature School of the Prophets. I have not noticed that phrase used outside of LDS literature, but our hopes and aspirations are for better trained workers, both men and women, for the spiritual harvest which is awaiting us. The publishing house and bookstore are directed by Dr. Moore, formerly an evangelistic worker in Concepcion and Temuco. Branches of the bookstore are operated in Antofagasta, Valparaiso, Concepcion, and Temuco. The Chilean Baptist Convention publishes a journal, La Voz Bautista, the Baptist Voice, which Dr. Moore edits. Miss Moore edits La Ventana, the Window, a publication for Baptist women, which is widely used by the churches of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico. Miss George Ma Ogburn, after serving as directress of the Women's Training School, accepted the responsibility of leading all Baptist women's and young people's work in Chile. While the phrase in the Bible that says that women should not speak in church, ecclesia, would also extend to forbidding that sort of a role. So this is just part of my proof here. There's something the Bible says that there's not a contradiction with, that goes against. There's always something with every church, as far as I know. Hers is a vitally important phase of the missionary undertaking in a territory which extends over 1,200 miles from the deserts in the north to the lake country in the south. In describing her work, she writes, "The Antofagasta district of the Women's Missionary Union was received into the convention last year after completing their first district-wide institute for women. There were about 100 present, and of this number, 33 received certificates. Senora Cristina de Docmac, first graduate of the training school in Santiago, is superintendent of the district, and she did an excellent job of planning the week's study, not only for Antofagasta, but also for the mining centers of Pedro de Valdivia and Chuquicamata. A similar institute has been conducted annually in Temuco and has made a lasting contribution to the Women's Missionary Unit of Southern Chile. Valparaiso, Vale of Paradise. Valparaiso. Okay, yeah, I got that one right. Chile's finest harbor, and for centuries, its only port of entry lies northwest of Santiago. Before the construction of the Panama Canal, all Chilean commerce from Europe and the United States was routed around Cape Horn to this point. The exquisite beauty of the crescent-shaped harbor can best be appreciated from the deck of a steamer and at night when the lights of the city, which rise precipitously from the harbor, flash like 1,000 diamonds. The Southern Cross in the skies is a reminder that one is almost 2,500 miles south of the equator. In the early 1880s, about the time that Westrup was martyred in Mexico and young W.B. Bagby was pioneering for Christ in Brazil, a missionary-minded Baptist pastor in Germany answered God's call to preach in Chile, bidding farewell to his Berlin congregation. Pastor Oscar von Barkwitz, with his wife and 3 children, left for Hamburg to await ship passage. There, a cholera epidemic struck in all its fury, and in a short time, all 3 of the children were taken. In World War II, it was typhoid. Bewildered and heartbroken, the parents debated the advisability of going on. After agonizing prayer, believed that God's call remained unchanged. They boarded ship for the long journey around Cape Horn. The Chilean government at that time was anxious to welcome more immigrants and invited Pastor Barkwitz to return to Germany and organize a colony to settle on free land in southern Chile. When he insisted that he had come as a missionary, the government promised him freedom to proclaim the gospel wherever he desired if he would only bring back another German colony. He finally agreed and returned later with a number of Baptist immigrants to settle in the far south. For many years, Pastor Isaias Valdivia, son of 2 of these Baptist pioneers, directed the work of the First Baptist Church of Valparaiso. He was associated with Reverend L.D. Wood from the Santiago Seminary, who had general supervision of the Valparaiso area. In 1948, Reverend J.I. Miller, with his family, moved to Valparaiso as our first resident Baptist missionary to this flourishing seaport city of 250,000 inhabitants. He has led in the construction of a beautiful and commanding church, building on the main thoroughfare of the city, open to all who will pause to listen to the eternal gospel of the Son of God. In lovely Vina del Mar, near Valparaiso, another church has been organized to reach some of the 80,000 people of the community. From these 2 centers, an expanding missionary and evangelistic ministry is reaching out toward towns and villages that have never heard the Baptist message. The beautiful new temple in Valparaiso and the widening ministry of missionaries are a fitting memorial to a broken-hearted father and mother who stepped ashore 3/4 of a century ago to preach the unsearchable riches of Christ. The Valley of Chile, south of Santiago, stretches one of South America's most fertile farming sections, aptly called the breadbasket of Chile. With the exception of the Santiago and Valparaiso districts. It is also the most populous area in Chile and is dotted with prosperous towns and cities. From Santiago, a famed streamlined train, the Flecha Arrow rolls steadily southward, following the valley for 700 miles to its terminal, Puerto Montt. On religious holidays, probably not the biblical ones, probably like Christmas, Easter, Halloween, or whichever ones are more popular among the Catholic holidays. The railroad stations throughout the valley are crowded with pilgrims who sometimes squeeze into cattle cars by the hundreds to journey to the holy shrines. In these villages, you become more aware of Chile's poverty, which is always present but not as noticeable in the gleaming cities. From the train, countrymen can be seen goading giant oxen across the fields, which are bordered with stately poplar and cypress trees. In wintertime, each farmer wears a long, dark wool manta, or cape, which serves him as overcoat, raincoat, and blanket. Proud Huasos, Chilean cowboys, swing aboard at noisy stations wearing broad-brimmed hats, short jackets, tight-fitting trousers, high-heeled boots, and giant spurs, passing through Rancagua, a great mining center. The train rushes on through 4 provinces to reach Talca, center of the wine-growing district and a reminder of southern France, situated on the banks of the Rio Claro Talca, with a population of 60,000, is the largest city between Santiago and Temuco and forms a logical mission center for reaching into the neighboring provinces of Curaçao, Mala, and Linares. Reverend and Mrs. J.W. McGavock were our first missionaries to serve in Talca, arriving in 1925. During the devastating earthquake of 1928, the church building was completely destroyed, but a new temple was constructed the following year. About 100 miles to the south stands Chilean, a city of 50,000 inhabitants. And if you have current numbers for any of this stuff, please comment, which still bears the marks of another tragic earthquake which snuffed out the lives of 11,000 people in one awful night during 1939. The Chilean pastor and his family escaped miraculously and lived to see a beautiful new Baptist church building rise from the ruins of the old. A short distance farther south, train coaches are switched to another track for a brief ride westward to Concepcion, Chile's third largest metropolis, with 100,000 inhabitants, founded on the banks of the river Biobio by Pedro Valdivia in 1550 era Ogaris. It served as an outpost against the depredations of the Araucanians, who had retreated to the southern banks of the river. To every Chilean schoolboy, it is the best known for the patriotism of Juan Martinez de Rosas, who led in the struggle for independence, which was proclaimed there in 1818. Looking from the heights of a lovely park, Caracol, one sees the city spread out below in all its beauty. To the south, the Biobio emptying into the Pacific, and to the north, the blue waves of the Bay of Concepcion, washing the shores of Talcahuano. Chilean naval base. Concepcion is an education center with a university that ranks second only to that in Santiago in enrollment, and a large agricultural school that is well known as an experiment station for the development of the provinces of southern Chile. Here, Dr. and Mrs. R.C. Moore, our second missionary couple to arrive in Chile, lived for 14 eventful years, laying the foundations of Baptist churches in the city and surrounding territory. After they moved to Temuco, 16 years were to pass before a successor was found. In 1950, Reverend and Miss Evan F. Holmes assumed responsibility for this important mission center. Some 500 miles south of Santiago, the train comes to a stop in the cavernous, steel-constructed station of Temuco, city of 50,000 inhabitants and capital of the province of Cautin. Temuco is the center of a large settlement of about 100,000 Araucanian Indians who live in villages scattered over this southern territory and who gather in great numbers for the early morning market to display pottery, silverware, and rugs. When we remember that these Indians resisted the invaders for 3 centuries, it is not surprising to discover a survival of many age-old religious and social customs. Following the tragic pattern of most South American Indians, they now live in abject poverty. It was in the region of Temuco that the German immigrants who had been brought over by Pastor von Barkwitz settled about 1884. Among them was Philip Meyer, whose prophetic preaching stirred his fellow colonists to the depths. German Baptist churches, having already been organized, the burden of responsibility for preaching to the Chileans weighed heavily on the hearts of the Lichtenberg brothers, members of this German community. As they went forth to proclaim the gospel of redeeming love, revivals broke out, and scores of Chileans turned to the Lord. Well, if they were already Catholic, obviously they already were Christian. A few years later, in 1888, Reverend W.D.T. MacDonald arrived with his family from Scotland as a contract teacher for the Chilean government. He was soon actively at work establishing and developing Baptist churches. And in 1908, with the assistance of missionary W.B. Bagby of Brazil, he organized the Chilean Baptist Union at Cajon. Contributions were reported from the Baptists of Cuba, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, who rejoiced with their Chilean brothers in this spiritual advance. Dr. and Miss Moore had general supervision of this field from 1934 to 1949, directing the activities of the First Baptist Church, which reaches hundreds of students attending the Colegio Bautista. Their ministry in Temuco was crowned with the construction and dedication of a beautiful new church building in 1949, complete with a 3-story educational unit, the joint gift of the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, and the Jarman Foundation. It now serves as a great center for all Baptist work in southern Chile. Its ample quarters being used for study courses, institutes, and pastors' conferences. Reverend W.Q. Maher, who formerly served as general evangelist for all Chile, succeeded Dr. Moore as pastor. Reverend and Mrs. J.F. Mitchell devote their energies to the evangelization of Temuco, with its 4 Baptist churches, and of scattered congregations in surrounding provinces. To Baptists everywhere, Temuco is known primarily for the Baptist Academy, or Colegio Bautista, founded in 1922 by the talented and gracious Agnes Graham, with 10 young girls as its first students. A Phi Beta Kappa student in the University of Texas, Miss Graham came under spiritual influence of Dr. Charles E. Madry, then pastor of the University Baptist Church of Austin, and dedicated her life to world mission service. For a quarter of a century, she served with Miss Cornelia Brower, Miss Ann Lassiter, and Miss Marjorie Spence as her associate. Now a co-educational school enrolling over 400 students, the school has been recognized by the Chilean government for its scholastic and moral worth. Now we recognize some of these names as being the same names as some very famous other preachers, Graham and Wood, and so perhaps it's become a family endeavor, perhaps not. Friends on 2 continents were overcome with grief when news reached them in 1947 that Miss Agnes had been called home. As the funeral procession moved down the streets of Temuco, it was led by the mayor of the city and the governor of the province, and followed by hundreds of friends. It was their way of paying tribute to the unselfish service of one who had left home and dear ones to lose her life for Christ's sake among the Chileans she so loved. As expressed by a friend, her most enduring memorial will be in the lives of a multitude of believers who saw in her the charm and courage of a Christian and followed her Savior in deathless devotion and joyful service. Miss Cornelia Brower served for 3 years as directress of the school with the cooperation of Miss Marjorie Spence, Miss Ruby House, Miss Rebecca Ettinger, Miss Roberta Ryan, and Miss W.Q. Maher. To Miss Brower's great joy, Professor Timoteo Gattaca, a former pupil of Miss Graham, was elected to the presidency of the institution in 1949 and was installed with proper ceremony. Miss Elizabeth Pacheco, granddaughter of W.D.T. MacDonald, pioneer missionary to Chile, presided. In keeping with the occasion, David Standen, manual training teacher, had carved a block of Chilean hardwood to represent a burning torch above an open Bible, symbolizing the motto of the school, a light that shineth in a dark place. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 19. Beneath it, silver plaques were affixed, bearing the names of the 3 presidents of the institution. In giving the charge, Miss Brower said earnestly, Timoteo Gattaca, I pass on to you the lighted torch of the gospel message and the open Bible emblem of the Colegio Bautista, which was established for the sole purpose of teaching the youth of Chile the love of Christ for a lost world and his redeeming power to save. This task is yours as a sacred trust. In this scene is dramatically revealed the ultimate purpose of all missionaries around the world, to place responsibility squarely on the shoulders of capable national leaders while they themselves continue to work with them as fellow laborers in the service of Christ. Agnes Graham rests in the soil of the land she loved. On her grave, bouquets of the lovely wax-like Capihu, Chile's national flower, are placed tenderly, their bell-shaped crimson blossoms, symbolic of the blood of those who died for Chile's national freedom, symbolize also the sacrifice of those who have died for the truth that will make all men free. Driving back to Temuco from a village church service one evening, we saw the setting sun, flaming red, reflected in the clouds like some giant forest fire. In the distance, snow-covered volcanoes caught the soft afterglow, their summits changing to a delicate pink. The snows that blanketed the Andes along the eastern Chilean border during the cool autumn days would melt with the coming of spring, and the Central Valley blossom again into exquisite beauty. So, the heartwarming gospel that we would share with lovely Chile can melt the icy peaks of indifference and neglect, bringing warmth, light, and life to all who would open their hearts to receive the compassionate Christ. Now, Christ would mean anointed, so something would have to anoint and would be part of some order. And Messiah can also have meanings of becoming or traveling. Emmanuel, Am is again something belonging to God. So the dwelling among the people that belongs to God. Because all those things that end in Yah are all, or like angel names or whatever. It's not referring to divinity itself. Masiach. So all these terms literally would be denying Christianity. Of course, a Christian takes them figuratively, right? And when I say that, such and such church does something that doesn't agree with the Bible, and, it's not like the Bible has a different opinion in that matter. Sometimes it does in some things. I'm not saying that per se that's right. Like, for example, the idea that women have no public voice, no voice outside the family, ecclesia, they're not supposed to speak in that. So, people say, oh, well, it's just, they're not supposed to speak during the sermon to other people. It's like, no, it's at all. But I'm not saying that that's like the right thing. Like in a masjid, if you go to a masjid and a man makes a mistake in the prayer, or he says something that Islam says something different about, a woman could speak up, or if a woman has a question, she can speak up. And that's been there from the beginning of this era.